All right, well, thanks so much for everybody for coming out. My name's John Foster. I'm a librarian here at Mentor Public Library. So this is the second in a 4-lecture series on the Korean War. So when you hear words like, names like Belleau Wood, Guadalcanal, Pililui, Tarawa, Okinawa, Iwo Jima, these are the sort of moments on which the reputation of the U.S. Marine Corps was built. And it's hard to even, I have goosebumps now saying all those names, when you know what happened at those places. I mean, if you're interested, there's a lot of great books. I recommend Lecky's A Helmet for My Pillow. Lecky was a Marine who served on Guadalcanal, also I think on Iwo Jima. But then also there's Eugene Sledge's book, With the Old Breed. Eugene Sledge was on Pililui, and when you know what happened at Pililui, it's like, it's hard to even say the word without getting, you know, a little choked up because it was a very intense battle. But tonight I want to talk about the Battle of Chosin predominantly. The battle around Chosin Reservoir, which happened between about November 24th and December 4th, 1950, was one of the most intense battles in the history of American arms. It was undertaken under some of the most extreme conditions. Temperatures may have dropped to minus 35 in the course of the battle. It was so cold that the tanks that were up there, they had to run them all night, and oftentimes they would find that in the morning the tank's treads had frozen to the ground, and it needed another tank to give it a sort of a push to get it going. And you can look at this as a defeat for the United States. I don't think so. The United States forces did end up retreating from Chosin Reservoir, but they did so in good order. And this is the really remarkable thing, and not to in any way to slight the courage and professionalism of other branches of the U.S. military, but the way that the 1st Marine Division showed out at Chosin Reservoir is really one of the most remarkable moments in American military history. And some, you know, when I came around to give this lecture, it's a real pleasure in a way to get to talk about this sort of illustration of incredible courage, incredible dedication, incredible professionalism on the part of the men of the U.S. Marine Corps. But it is also a very sad story, and one that tells you a lot about the problems faced by the U.S. government, the U.S. military, UN forces in Korea in 1950 and into the beginning of 1951. So the first part of the story is the Incheon landing, when predominantly the U.S. Marine Corps, there were some Army troops involved, landed at the port of Incheon, which is just west of Seoul, about halfway up the coast of Korea. This idea had originally been conceived of by MacArthur in the summer of 1950. It was originally titled Operation Blue Heart, and if you look in the history, it's discussed under that name for a long time. But it was the sort of first point, not exactly the first point, the 1st Marine Provisional Division. So the United States was short of combat-ready divisions in the summer of 1950. As I talked about in the last lecture, the United States defense budget had been cut down from $93 billion in 1945 to roughly $15 billion in 1950. And there's a lot of debate about why that happened. If you read some books, particularly The Darkest Summer, you see Truman on the hook for it. He certainly was to an extent, but Republicans in Congress were also pushing him to cut the defense budget, to cut taxes. And Truman believed that he was doing what the American people wanted, what he had been given a mandate to do, especially with his election victory in 1948, 47. There's blame to go around, let's just say. But when it came down to responding to the North Korean attack in the summer of 1950, the United States had to put together, was very short of combat-ready military formations. And they started trying to draw on the U.S. Marine Corps. What happened too, and some of you will know this, is that a number of Marines, a number of men who had served in the U.S. Marine Corps in the Second World War and had then gone out of the Corps had, some without even really noticing, been enrolled in the Marine Reserve. And so 1950 comes around and the U.S. government goes to them and says, okay, now time to go back in. By this time, they have families, right? They have businesses. They're getting on with their lives. But no, once a Marine, always a Marine. So here you go. The Incheon landing, there's just a couple of things that I want to mention about it. There was an interesting thing going on with the command structure. So the Incheon landing was done basically to get the US 8th Army on the ground, to cut off the North Korean People's Army. But there was a split in the command structure of US forces. There was the 8th Army under Walton Johnny Walker, who had led the defense of the Pusan perimeter. And then there was 10th Corps, which was split off. And 10th Corps was put under the command of Ned Almond. General Edmund Almond was MacArthur's chief of staff. So he was wearing two hats, which usually you're not allowed to do. He was in one hat, the chief of staff, MacArthur's chief of staff, and in another held this combat command. Almond was sort of bitter that he hadn't come out of the Second World War better, and he is a person whose reputation has suffered from further historical examination. One person who knew him said, when it paid to be aggressive, Ned Almond was aggressive. And when it paid not to be aggressive, Ned Almond was aggressive. But he also didn't have a great, so one of the interesting things, and I mentioned this in the last talk, is that there was a move afoot in those days, in the late 1940s, to eliminate the Marine Corps. It was viewed as duplicating things that the US Army already did. The thinking was, we have the atomic bomb. We're not going to need to do amphibious landings anymore. Also, the same people, and this is not, partly it was Lewis Johnson, the defense secretary, one of the more unfortunate figures in American public life, but also the Joint Chiefs of Staff were pushing for military, sort of coalescing military forces. This is why, by the way, we have a defense secretary instead of Secretary of the Army, Secretary of the Navy, because it was all part of this. So, but another idea was that we were going to drastically cut back the Navy, right? Because what did the Navy do that we needed done? We have planes, right? The Air Force, this is the time when the Air Force becomes a service of its own, and the thinking among a lot of the military strategy types, not just in the civilian army, was that we don't really need the Navy because we could just fly the atomic bomb to wherever we want it to go. So, not to say that the Korean War was a good thing, but one of the effects of the Korean War was to illustrate the importance of the US Marine Corps. And there's an argument to be made, and there's a number of books that make it, that the US Marine Corps was, in a lot of respects, saved by the Korean War and by its performance in the Korean War. So one of the funny things about Ned Almond is that he kind of didn't know the first thing about amphibious landings. And the reason I have this picture here, does anyone know who this is? Yes.
Krulak.
Yes, Victor Krulak.
Brute.
Yes, Brute Krulak. Do you know why he got that nickname?
I forget.
Because he was about 5'4", and when he was in a military academy, all of his friends used to joke that he was a brute because he was. It's like calling a 300-pound guy tiny. Yeah. But Victor Krulak, who had a really interesting career in the U.S. military, eventually, I believe, was the commandant of the Marine Corps, if I'm not mistaken. He was at least second in command because he was running the troop deployments in Vietnam out of Hawaii during the Vietnam War. But in any case, he was on the boat. He was on the one of the sort of ships next to Ned Almond, and this sort of like amphibious tanks start coming out. And Almond looks over at him and says, "Do those things actually float?" And Krulak said, "I went and told 10 people because I wanted it remembered that the guy running the operation had no idea about like the technology that we were using to run this operation," which was not the only thing about which Ned Almond was at sea, so to speak. So once the Incheon landing had been successful and the Seoul had been liberated, the debate was then, what next, right? So the question is, okay, we're mopping up the remains of the North Korean People's Army. What are we going to do now? And there was very strong pressure from what's referred to as the China lobby there was a group of congressmen, mostly Republicans, who were very activated by this so-called loss of China. William Nolan of California was among the most prominent ones. Nolan said after the Incheon landing, failure to liberate North Korea would be an act of appeasement of international communism. Representative Hugh Scott spoke of the Hiss Survivors Association down at the State Department. This is a reference to Alger Hiss, who's a State Department official who was convicted of perjury. In fact, he was probably probably on further review, he was certainly a communist agent. And there's a number of really interesting books lately that have come out with the sort of thorough proof. But there was a kind of feeling. So Senator McCarthy had said that he had a list of 205, I think. It was an oddly specific number, communist agents in the State Department, which he never showed to anybody. I think it was one of those things more sort of said for effect. But so there's a debate going on, and I haven't put this up here because I think you're going to read it. But basically what this is NSC 81/1, which, that is to say, it's a National Security Council paper. And basically what it is the justification the legal justification for the U.S. Army going into North Korea. Now, there's a big issue here, right? Because the more into North Korea the U.S. Army goes, the closer it gets to the Chinese border. And that's an iffy thing. There's a lot of Chinese people. And they're probably, it was sort of understood that they were not going to be terribly thrilled about the U.S. getting close to the border, U.S. troops. Also, I mean, it had been one of the prime motivating forces of Truman's policy to keep the issue of Korea separated from the issue of Taiwan. The nationalist Chinese under Chiang Kai-shek had set up a government in Taiwan. When the Korean War broke out, Chiang Kai-shek offered 30,000 troops to go fight in Korea. Lewis Johnson and some other people in the U.S. military or in the U.S. government were very high on this idea. The Joint Chiefs of Staff were not. And one reason being was they already lost. They already showed they couldn't beat the communist Chinese on the mainland. Why would we send them to Korea? I mean, the number one propensity of nationalist Chinese soldiers during the Chinese Civil War was to switch sides and give up all their weapons to the communists. So you can kind of see why they put the kibosh on that idea. In July, I believe it was July 1950, MacArthur made a completely on his own recognizance visit to Taiwan to meet with Chiang Kai-shek, where he kissed Madam Chiang's hand and referred to Chiang Kai-shek, a man who he had never met, as my old comrade in arms. But so what's clear from this is that MacArthur did not get very clear guidance. He was sort of instructed, well, don't get American troops themselves near the Yalu River, which is the border between North Korea and Manchuria. Try to use Korean troops. Well, okay, there's the problem. There's the number one problem. One of the things that is true in pretty much every phase of the Korean War is that the ROK forces, or the ROKs as they were often referred to, were not very good and had the tendency to melt away like snow on a warm day when North Korean People's Army or Chinese People's Volunteer Army troops showed up. So the idea that a serious move toward the Yalu was going to be spearheaded by Republic of Korea troops was extremely optimistic, I think is the nicest way that you could put that. Also, the Chinese, and particularly Zhou Enlai, had been not very secretive about how they would view U.S. troops getting up to the Chinese border. And Zhou Enlai, especially in a couple of talks he had with K.M. Panikkar, who was the Indian ambassador to China, had said, we will not stand by with our arms folded if the U.S. Army comes up to our border. And at a second point in October, Panikkar said, he made a similar comment to Panikkar, and Panikkar said, well, you know that the U.S. forces have crossed the 38th parallel, and Zhou Enlai said, yes, I do. And Panikkar told the State Department about these comments, but Panikkar was a social democrat. He was not a communist. He was actually notoriously anti-communist, but he was on the political left. And the people in the State Department said, well, Panikkar, he's probably in his heart of hearts really sympathetic to the Chinese. So they didn't take it particularly seriously. October 15th, 1950, Truman and MacArthur meet for the first time at Wake Island. They originally Truman had suggested it, and when the US president says to you as a military officer, I would like you to come, that's more in the nature of a you must do it. But MacArthur had said no on both occasions. He had too much stuff to do. And then Truman said, well, let's meet. We'll meet in Honolulu. And MacArthur said, well, I can't be away that long. Let's meet at Wake Island, which is 4,900 miles from Washington, D.C. and about 1,900 miles from Tokyo. A lot of myths have arisen about this particular meeting. It's the number one being that MacArthur delayed his plane so that Truman would have to wait on him. That's not true. However, MacArthur did not salute Truman when Truman got off the plane. And that is a serious violation of protocol. Because even if you do not like the man who is the president, the fact of the matter is you're saluting the rank, not the man, and he's the commander-in-chief. That's just how it is. And Truman let it pass. Halberstam makes a really funny comment about that in the coldest winter. That's the thing about the American president. If you choose to take notice of something, then it happened. If you choose not to, then it didn't happen. But later, after he was in retirement, a reporter asked Truman, did you notice that MacArthur had not saluted when you got off the plane? And Truman said, you're goddamn right I did. Truman was not a stupid man, but he also understood that A, MacArthur was very popular, and B, he had to get along with the guy, right? Because they have a bigger job here. The deal is not, I feel about this person or how that person feels about me. The deal is, we have the business of the country that we have to do, and in order to do it, we have to work together effectively. So they have this meeting, and later it turned out there was an almost word-for-word transcript of what happened in the meeting with the officials, and it was because a woman, I always have to look up her name, she has a very average American name, Vernice Anderson, secretary to Philip Jessup, who was a State Department official, was seated outside the door of where the meeting was happening and took shorthand notes of the whole thing. There's only two things there's a lot of discussion of various things, which if we were talking about this particular event, we could talk about in more detail, but basically, MacArthur predicted that the troops would be home by Christmas. And then the following exchange took place. Truman, what are the chances for Chinese or Soviet interference? MacArthur, very little. Had they interfered in the first or second months, it would have been decisive. We're no longer fearful of their intervention, and here he's talking about the Chinese. We no longer stand hat in hand. The Chinese have 300,000 men in Manchuria. Of these, probably not more than 100 to 125,000 are distributed along the Yalu River. Only 50 to 60,000 could be gotten across the Yalu. They have no air force. Now that we have air bases for our air force in Korea, the Chinese tried to get to Pyongyang, there would be the greatest slaughter. Part of the reason that he believed this was because of his intelligence officer, Richard Willoughby, who, as with many people on MacArthur's staff, was very adept at saying things to MacArthur that MacArthur wanted to be true. MacArthur disliked the Chinese intensely, and not just because they were communists. He just disliked them. He also believed that they didn't have what it took to invade. And so even though, and as we get into this a little further, you'll see that there were very good reasons to believe that there were Chinese soldiers in Northern Korea, Willoughby kept saying, no, they would capture Chinese soldiers, and it happened that the Republican Korea forces captured a Chinese soldier, and the local commander went and interviewed the guy, and the guy said, yeah, I'm from somewhere in Southwest China. And so he took him to the headquarters of 1st Marine Division, and of the 8th Army, and they sort of interrogated him, and they sent it up the chain. And Willoughby said, no, what he is a North Korean who was living in China and probably fought for a while with the Chinese communist forces in the war, of which there was actually a fair number, probably a quarter to a third of the North Korean People's Army originally were veterans of Mao's army in the Chinese Civil War. But these were clearly Chinese soldiers. There's no two ways about it. But what Willoughby did was to reconfirm or reinforce MacArthur's belief that they were not. So the original plan was for the 8th Army to advance north from Seoul, and for the 10th Corps to fight their way across and then advance north up the east coast of the country. The Taebaek Mountains run almost through the center of Korea and then up into the northern part. But it was decided, and the process of decision is complicated and a little hard to understand, that instead they would ship the 10th Corps around the south coast of Korea and up to the port of Wonsan, which they did. And here you see the transport fleet hanging outside of Wonsan, while the harbor was being demined, which took a couple of weeks. So here we have MacArthur. You can see Ned Almond behind him, and then there's Ned Almond right there. Here's Walton Johnny Walker. Walton Walker was pretty much convinced by this point that he was at the point of being replaced. And he was right. In fact, earlier on, Matthew Ridgway, whose name will come up quite a bit later on, had come over with some officials from the State Department to sort of see what the situation was. And this was during the battle at the Pusan perimeter. He basically said, well, we need to get, when they met on the way back, he said to the police, I think we kind of need somebody else. And the State Department guy said, yeah, we need you, right? And Ridgway said, no, don't say that to people, because it'll look like I came here looking for a job. And Ridgway didn't want to advance in that way. So here we have Ned Almond, and here we have Oliver P. Smith, the general commanding the 1st Marine Division. Smith is a fabulously interesting guy. He was a Christian Scientist from Texas. He had been the assistant commander of the 1st Marine Division on Peleliu. He was a quiet, sort of studious guy, but very different in a lot of ways from Ned Almond. Number one, Ned Almond used to go around Korea in a heated trailer. And at one point, Smith and his staff, they were sort of around dinner time, and Almond invited them to dinner. And dinner was served in this heated trailer, which also had its own bath, by soldiers in white uniforms with white gloves. And Oliver Smith thought that was the weirdest thing he'd ever seen in his life. In a combat zone, really? I mean, Oliver Smith, one of the sort of generally accepted practices, let's say, for officers in the Marine Corps, and this is also true in some respects in the Army, but the Marines, from what I've read, place a premium on this, was that you, to the greatest extent possible, want to be enduring a lot of the same conditions that the troops are, because if you're not, then it really is problematic in terms of your credibility. But another interesting difference between Smith and Almond was that as this thing started going, Smith was increasingly uneasy about the spread of forces. So those of you, and I'm sure there are many of you in this room who are familiar with Marine Corps tactical doctrines, put simply, it's close with the enemy as quickly as possible and destroy them, and strike with maximum force, right? What you want is compact forces that are going to close with the enemy and destroy them. But what he was being ordered to do was move forward quickly, but without making sure that they were creating a situation in which they were going to be successful. So here's Wonsan, and here you can see the sort of drive northward. This is Chosin Reservoir. Chosin is actually in Korean, Changjin. Chosin was what it was called in Japanese, and basically the U.S. military was operating on Japanese maps, so they called it what the Japanese called it. But during November, as they're headed northward, Smith reduced the progress of the 1st Marine Division to a mile or two a day. And one reason that he gave was because he wanted to widen the roads. The roads up there are ox carts, mostly, ox cart paths. And he wanted to widen it so that his trucks and armor could get up with him. Now, if Smith had been in the U.S. Army command structure, he certainly would have been relieved for insubordination. Ammen was constantly chivvying him, like, go faster, go faster. But because he was in the Marine Corps, they didn't want to cause inter-service friction by cashiering him. So he was able to not only widen the roads up toward Chosin Reservoir, but also to build 2 airfields on the way up there that would prove to be crucial when things really got hot at the end of November. Also, Smith and Ammen really disliked each other. Ammen habitually referred to Smith as son, even though he was only about 6 months younger than Smith was younger than him. And you just can't do that. I mean, that's I can't imagine any circumstances under which I would find myself addressing a Marine Corps general as son, I mean, for any reason. Yes?
What part did the Navy play in this? Did they show before the troops landed?
They did. Actually, the big part played by the Navy in this is that when the retreat happened and there was disembarkation at Hungnam, the Chinese People's Volunteer Army tried to sort of chase, and one reason that they weren't able to break the perimeter was that the Navy shelled from offshore to prevent them from following. Also, the Navy had 3 carriers off the coast, so which was part of the air support that the Marines and the other soldiers got up around Chosin Reservoir, which was crucial, absolutely crucial. I mean, here you can see this is heading north through the Taebaek Mountains, and you can kind of see this road has been widened, but this is the kind of territory that they were fighting in, and it's not great territory for armor necessarily or for motorized troops. And this is one of the unfortunate things about the U.S. military's approach to the war in Korea prior to the end of 1950. It changes after 1950 a bit, at least, and I'll explain why later. But if you're on one of these roads, especially if you're on the road, you know, at the bottom of a gully or whatever, you're in a bad position vis-a-vis people who are up on the top of there because gravity. Here are Marines. You can generally tell that they're Marines because of the helmets, but this is at Hagaruri, which is at the sort of base. So you can see the Chosin Reservoir extending away into the distance. So the first important thing when the 8th Army advanced in the west and the 10th Corps advanced in the east was that on the 25th of October, there was a massive Chinese attack centering on the town of Unsan, which is over here on the sort of more westerly part of the country. It followed a fairly familiar pattern. The Chinese attacked at night. There were kind of bugle calls. They used bugles. They didn't have very good electronic communication, so they used bugles and other kind of noisemakers, which worked great usually in the beginning phase of an attack. But one thing that the U.S. military, and particularly the Marines, noted was that they were not very good at following up attacks because they didn't really have great communication above, especially above battalion level, but even sort of below that. They attacked at night. The ROK troops sort of melted away. Most of them felt like they had something better to do. And it goes on for several days. It was not hugely costly in terms of casualties. I think there was a total of about 450 or 500 killed in the 1st Cavalry. The 1st Cavalry Division was an odd duck, so to speak, because they weren't really a cavalry division. They weren't mounted. But they did get to have the yellow handkerchiefs. But this is an interesting thing, too. When the U.S. forces reached Pyongyang, there was talk that they were going to go home. And so when there was talk there was going to be a big victory parade in Tokyo. And they all ought to make sure to have their nice uniforms ready for that parade. So many of them headed north without proper winter gear because they had been told, you know, by the time they reach Pyongyang, they're starting to shift material out of Korea. And when Unsan happened, they had to start shifting it rapidly, I mean to say. But another thing that happened is something that, number one, it became clear that there were a fairly large number of Chinese troops in the northern part of Korea. And that their fieldcraft was pretty good. They were not dependent on motorized transportation in the way that U.S. forces tended to be. They tended to get under cover and stay there, and so they were very hard to locate in a lot of cases. If you read the history of this and read what the soldiers who fought there have to say, they're generally quite complimentary about the Chinese fieldcraft. You don't have to like them, but you have to respect that they're good at what they were doing. But then after the 4th of November, they kind of melt away. Now, if you're in command of U.S. forces in the northern part of Korea at that point, you might think to yourself, what the heck just happened? All of a sudden, there were far more Chinese people around than we thought there were. And the message coming out of MacArthur's headquarters was, well, they were just trying to make a point. But now they've gone back, and it's okay. The Chinese, on the other hand, saw this as baiting a trap. They thought that MacArthur was arrogant. And what they wanted to do was to get the U.S. forces as far up into the northern part of Korea as they could. And so that was the point of this attack, was to convince the U.S. Army and the U.S. Marines. The U.S. Marines, it's very interesting what the Chinese, if you read their sort of internal commentary, the U.S. Marines, as far as they were concerned, were the lowest of the low. They were rapists and murderers, and so they really, when the fight came down at Chosin Reservoir, their sort of like internal propaganda was like, we have to smash the 1st Marine Division because they're the worst kind of people possible, which I think, you always want to make your enemy into the worst kind of person that you can. So then the move north continues. On November 21st, the 17th Regiment of the 7th Infantry Division reached the Yalu River up in the very northwestern part of Korea. Almond flew in, and he and his staff ceremonially pissed in the Yalu River to make the point. By that point, the temperature had dropped to -20 at night. Simultaneously, Smith's 1st Marine Division, along with Regimental Combat Team 31, 31st Regimental Combat Team. Now, Regimental Combat Team is something the U.S. military doesn't really use anymore. They moved to something called a pentonic structure or something like that. But a Regimental Combat Team is essentially a regiment augmented usually with artillery or armor or both. And it's generally put together for a specific purpose. And it's interesting to note that in the official histories, the 3 primary Marine regiments that were involved here were all referred to as regimental combat teams. The 1st Marine Regiment, the 5th Marine Regiment, and 7th Marine Regiment, in the official histories are referred to as regimental combat teams. But the 31st Regimental Combat Team, often referred to now as Task Force McLean, after its first commander, or Task Force Love, was built out of the 31st and 32nd Infantry Regiments of the U.S. Army. At the 1st, the 5th Marine Division went up the east side of Chosin Reservoir. So the Marines established one base at Kodori and then another forward base at Hagaru-ri. And as soon as they got into Hagaru-ri, Oliver P. Smith, General Smith, said, we're going to build an airfield there right now. Hagaru-ri is at an elevation of about 4,000 feet. According to the engineer's manuals, you need about 3,900 feet of runway to land a transport plane there. The engineers said, well, we've only got about 3,000 feet, but we'll make it work, right? So the 5th Marines adopt positions up here on the east side of the reservoir, and the 7th Marines move into position eventually first at Sinhungni and then at Udamni. And the theory was that there would be a 2-pronged attack west from Udamni. So the theory eventually was that the 5th Marines would move through the 7th Marines and attack westward from Udamni. And that 31st Regimental Combat Team would attack northward from their positions around the eastern edge of the reservoir. Keeping track of what happened in this battle is incredibly difficult, by the way. On the 26th of November, the 5th Marines start shifting over to Udamni. It's about 4 miles from Hagaruri to Sinhungni, and then about another 6 miles as the crow flies up the road to Udamni. And the 31st Regimental Combat Team takes over these positions. Now, the first thing that they discovered was that their regiment was not as big as the 5th Marine Regiment, so they were spread out rather thinner along this perimeter. But the theory was that once they were in position, excuse me, this is the 23rd, and I know this now, I recognize my error, because the 24th was supposed to be, November 24th was meant to be the jump-off date. So on the 24th, the 31st Regimental Combat Team was going to attack north, the 5th Marines, and then followed by the 7th Marines. Also, some elements of the 11th Marine Regiment were in Udamni. Mostly it was artillerists with 105 and 155 millimeter howitzers, which turned out to be a really good thing when things started to get ugly. So on the 24th, these attacks go off, but by about 1400 hours, both attacks stall. And in fact, the 31st Regimental Combat Team is under such heavy contact from the 80th Division of the what the Chinese like to call the People's Volunteer Army. When they put this together, they were like, well, we'll call it the Volunteer Army to make it seem like there's a kind of like popular uprising against this horrible threat posed by the... I doubt that there were that many people who were like, I definitely want to go up to Manchuria, possibly the coldest place on earth right at that moment, throw down with the US Marine Corps. By evening time on the 24th, it becomes clear that this is not necessarily going to work. And in fact, the 31st Regimental Combat Team is then the McLean, Colonel Alan McLean, who is the officer in command, realizes that he tells Lieutenant Colonel Don Carlos Love, his assistant, we've got to pull back to the 3rd Battalion, 31st Infantry positions across the inlet here, the Pyongyuri Gang Inlet. At the same time, Colonel Homer Leitzenberg, who's in command of the 7th Marines at Udamni, says, well, we got to make sure we can get out of here. He realized pretty quickly that the Chinese pressure was going to be so heavy that he didn't want to be trapped there. So he sent Fox Company of the 7th Marines to occupy a hill in the middle of Taktong Pass. And he sent Charlie Company of the 7th Marines to occupy a position at the opening of the Taktong Pass, thinking that because he knew Litzenberg had the reputation of being a little bit of a fuss budget, but he was respected by the officers around him, and he had been around long enough to know that the Chinese like to encircle. Their plan was, first they launch frontal attacks, then they try and encircle you and cut you off. Now, to be clear, there's about 30,000 US troops between the US Marines and the 31st Regimental Combat Team. There are probably on the order of 120,000 Chinese troops in the area, all ready to bring their forces to bear. The 80th, the 79th, the 89th, the 59th, the 58th, and the 68th divisions of the People's Volunteer Army, so to speak. On the 25th, Smith decides to send an armored task force up the road from Kodori to Hagaruri, led by the British 41st Commando, who are Royal Marines, along with some armored elements. They get stopped about 4 miles outside of Kodori by the 60th Division of the People's Liberation Army. I love the Chinese optimism. They fight a horrific battle at a place that came to be called by the people who fought there the Hellfire Valley. And it's got to be hot, right, for a place where a battle that happened in temperatures around -20 to get compared to hellfire. During the day, the Marines and the men of the 31st Regimental Combat Team are able to maintain their positions to a great extent because of attacks staged by the Marine Air Wing, who were much better than some of the other air resources there at coordinating, because they were Marines and because they realized, that their job was close ground support. They were much more effective than some of the other naval forces and other carrier forces at effective collaboration with the Marines on the ground. Also, this seems like kind of a long way, but in fact, this area was also subject to shelling by the guns of the elements of the 11th Marines, who were up in Udamni. Although their guns, the range of 155 millimeter howitzer, which is normally, I think, about 12,000 yards, maybe. Somebody who knows better might correct me, but it was reduced by about 25% because of the cold. I mean, the cold was so bad that it disrupted communications because it would kill radio batteries. Up through the 25th, Ned Almond is urging O.P. Smith and Alan McLean, okay, we need to really stage this attack that we've been planning. But eventually, he gets called back to Tokyo, where he has a meeting with MacArthur, and he tells MacArthur, look, we can turn this thing around. We just got to attack more vigorously. And MacArthur, by this point, has seen the light of day and realized that what they needed to do now was to stage a withdrawal, because there were now far more Chinese soldiers than he had previously imagined in the northern part of the country. Oh my gosh, I'm sorry, I completely forgot something, and I want to include this, because this is another sort of part of how messed up things were. On the 10th of November, when he was ordered up there, O.P. Smith had sent a letter to General Clifford Cates, the Commandant of the Marine Corps. He had gone outside the chain of command to send a letter to the Commandant of the Marine Corps in which he said, someone in high authority will have to make up his mind as to what is our goal. My mission is still to advance to the border. The 8th Army, 80 miles to the southwest, will not attack until the 20th. Manifestly, we should not push on without regard to the 8th Army. We would simply get further out on a limb. If the 8th Army push does not go, which it did not, then the decision will have to be made as to what to do next. I believe a winter campaign in the mountains of North Korea is too much to ask of the American soldier or Marine, and I doubt the feasibility of supplying troops in this area during the winter or providing for the evacuation of sick and wounded. Now, at the same time that this was happening, the 8th Army was not advancing. They were in fact in full retreat because they had also been attacked by about 120,000 soldiers from the People's Volunteer Army, who were coming out of Manchuria in extremely large numbers. And unlike the Marines, they were unable to hold on. In fact, a number of the units in the 8th Army were mauled so badly that it was 6 months before they were combat ready again. They took 11,000 casualties in 4 days. They were quite heavily outnumbered by the Chinese. And also, they didn't button up 360 degrees quite often, the Army units didn't, so that they would get flanked and they would lose unit cohesion and they would fall back. The Marines, more often, especially because a lot of them had fought in the Eastern Theater in the Second World War, understood that you have to button up at night 360 degrees. You cannot, and this is, we'll get into this more later, but this is one of the changes that Matthew Ridgway came in when he became commander of the 8th Army. He said, look, we're going to button up 360 degrees at night all the time. And if we get cut off, that's fine. We're going to resupply by air. And why did he think this? Because what had Matthew Ridgway done during the Second World War? He had been in command of the 82nd Airborne. He had 5 combat jumps with the 82nd Airborne. And so as far as he was concerned, he was a paratrooper, you're always cut off. That's not a reason to get worried about things, right? What you need to do is maintain your position, get resupplied by air, and, maintain your effectiveness. And that was the big, when I get to the third lecture in this, we get to the Battle of Twin Tunnels, the tactics of which are still taught at the Command and General Staff School. That battle was won because U.S. forces took a position, buttoned up all the way around, and then allowed the North Koreans to exhaust themselves, or the Chinese to exhaust themselves in these human wave attacks, which were incredibly costly. I mean, by the way, over the course of this thing, the Chinese probably suffered almost 7,500 fatalities, like combat fatalities, and then another probably 30,000 non-battle fatalities. The Chinese also were not prepared. Like if you see the gear of captured Chinese soldiers, they're wearing these like padded uniforms and sneakers, which I assure you, in temperatures of -20, do not offer much in terms of protection. So through the next several days, it becomes clear that there's going to have to be a retreat to Hagaru-ri. The 31st Regimental Combat Team keeps coming under heavy pressure. They finally move south. As they get to the perimeter of the 3rd Battalion and 31st Infantry, Alan McLean, their commanding officer, saw what he thought was, number one, he realized that they were under attack and it was going to be very difficult to get into their perimeter without getting shot. But he saw a group of soldiers who he thought were Americans, and he started running toward them. And then he realized that they were being shot at from the 31st's perimeter. And what he thought apparently was happening was this was a friendly fire incident. So he starts running forward, shouting, "Hey, stop, those are our guys." And he's shot repeatedly by the guys who were in fact Chinese, and ended up dying 4 days later, according to a witness in captivity. That left the 31st Regimental Combat Team under the command of Don Carlos Love, Lieutenant Colonel. At a certain point, oh my God, this is so horrible. Almond flew up on the 28th to the perimeter and brought with him 3 silver stars, and he said, yeah, just give these to whoever will motivate people, which is a pretty cheap idea, I think. And in fact, Love was given one of them, and then after Almond left, he took it off and just threw it into a snowbank because he was so annoyed at what Almond was trying to do. But so by the 29th, Love realizes that they need to withdraw, but he hasn't got orders to withdraw, and he can't get them. They won't give them. Finally, and I want to get the date right on this. On Almond's first trip, by the way, and this gives you another insight into the perimeter, which was, I believe, on the 27th, or the 28th, I guess, Almond still thought that they could attack and told McLean and Faith, "We're going all the way to the Yalu. Don't let a bunch of Chinese laundrymen stop you." That's a dumb thing to say, right? I mean, I understand that he's trying to motivate them, but the fact of the matter is you cannot disrespect your opponent in that way. Once again, you cannot like him. You can want to kill him, but you have to respect his ability as a soldier, because if you do not, and he surprises you, as happened here, you put yourself in a very, very dangerous situation. Finally, on November 30th, Faith gets the message, okay, you're now under Smith. You're now in the Marine command structure. And Smith says, okay, we want you to pull back to Hagaru-ri via Hudong-ni. We can give you air cover, but that's it. There's no rescue. We can't get to you. So you're going to have to fight your way back to this position, which they try to do. And on the way, they engage in a series of very hot firefights, and Faith is eventually killed. Faith was awarded the Medal of Honor. His remains were not found until 2007. There was a joint South Korean-North Korean operation to recover remains from the Korean War, and he was finally buried in Arlington National Cemetery in 2013. But just to recall, in the course of this battle, there were about 4,300 missing. Many of them captured, but some of them just killed in places where they couldn't be recovered. Eventually, in the course of fighting their way back, about 1,000 members of Regimental Combat Team 31 out of 3,000 originally make their way back across the ice into Hagaru-ri, but only about 350 of them, 380 of them, were viewed as being in a psychological or physical condition for further service. On the other side of the reservoir, Litzenberg and his 7th Marines have decided they're going to move back. They had sent a couple of companies out to link up with Charlie Company and bring them back. They had tried to get to Fox Company on what came to be called Fox Hill, but had been repulsed a couple of times. So Litzenberg, on November 30th, sends Lieutenant Colonel Ray Davis with the 1st Battalion of the 7th Marines, which he called his Ridge Runners, to move around. That's Hagaru-ri. That's Alan McLean. Right there, that's Don Carlos Love. There's also Don Carlos Love. There they are being lectured by Ned Almond. These are, I believe, 1st Marine Regiment, but I'm not sure. A lot of times they don't label these pictures effectively. These are C-119s waiting to resupply. These are Marines. Once again, I think this is 1st Marines watching a napalm strike on the way south. These are the dispositions of Fox Company on Fox Hill. You can see here's the MSR, which is what they call the road through there, and MSR stands for the main supply route. You can see they're oriented away from the highway, right? I say highway. It was a glorified ox cart path. But it's because this is the direction that the attacks have been coming from. Here we see Captain William Barber, over on the right there, or your left, who was in command of Fox Company, Lieutenant Colonel Ray Davis, the commanding officer of the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, and PFC Hector Cafarata. And what you'll notice, if you can see closely enough, is that they're all wearing the Congressional Medal, the Medal of Honor, which they all won in the course of, number one, Fox Company's incredible stand under repeated heavy attacks, and also Davis's troops, who had to fight for 3 days. So they were sent, when they moved south out of Udamni, Davis's troops were sent overland. That's why Litzenberg called them the Ridge Runners. So he thought, well, the Chinese are going to be looking for them on the road. So we're going to start advancing that way, but we're going to send Davis and his guys around this way to Fox Hill. On December 2nd, at 6:30 in the morning, Davis's men were 600 yards from Fox Company, and Fox Company made contact with them by radio. And Barber said, well, I'm glad you're here. Would you like me to send out a patrol to guide you in? And Davis thought that was the craziest thing he'd ever heard. Here he was with a full battalion coming to their rescue, and Barber's like, yeah, we'll send out a patrol, you know. But it was just because, I mean, Barber had done such a good job of maintaining the unit cohesiveness and the morale of those guys that even after 4 days of incredibly intense combat, I mean, after the first day, they sandbagged their position with the bodies of dead Chinese soldiers. There were so many dead Chinese around their position. They managed to maintain their cohesion. Finally, at 11 a.m. on December 2nd, 1st Battalion made it into the Fox Company perimeter. By that time, the Chinese were so exhausted. I mean, Chinese human wave attacks. There's a funny point in the Neil Stephenson book Cryptonomicon where an American Marine raider is talking to a Japanese soldier, and the Marine raider says to the guy, "Don't you know that human wave attacks don't work?" And the Japanese soldier says, "Yeah, all the people who know that are dead." But there was still significant fighting to be done on the way down the road from Udamni down to Hagaru-ri. Here you can see members of the, I believe, once again, these are 7th Marine Regiment getting ready to ship out from from Hagaru-ri, excuse me, it's hard to keep these names separated, toward Kodo-ri. This is a picture of the Hellfire Valley, which is right here below Hagaru-ri, and which was another place where there was a series of horrific firefights, this time undertaken with lots of wrecked equipment from Task Force Drysdale's attempt to come up in the other direction. The next day, when the 1st Battalion of the 7th Marines and Fox Company got to the perimeter at Hagaru-ri, they dressed their lines, they dressed their marching lines, and came in singing the Marine Corps hymn, which I think is kind of, it sounds kind of corny, but they were all at that point like, look, we did this thing that's worthy of recognition, and this thing which we're proud to do as Marines, in addition to just being glad that we survived. This is in the Funchilin Pass, which is, you can see on this map, is on the way from Koduri down south. They're headed for the port of Hungnam. And what they discovered was that the Chinese, so this is a water pumping station. This thing right here is this, which you kind of can't see, I understand, but that's what it is. And you can see these water pipes heading south. They had blown the bridge here. You can see the bridge is blown. And the US Air Force was able to drop in bridge sections that they were able to use to patch the bridge. And by this time, there was some fighting down the way, but most of the Chinese forces were pretty exhausted. And here you can see, I think these are Army. I think these are the remains of the 31st or the 32nd Regiment, or the remains of the 31st Regimental Combat Team. And the reason is because Army parkas tend to be a little bit shorter. So I've read. I have like one of these, M1951 parkas that I got in a thrift store somewhere, and I really treasure the thing because it's for this reason. Although I think to myself, my God, like, okay, this is a nice jacket, but in -20, I hope you were layering up, those of you who were in Korea, because that really sounds very unpleasant. So by the second week of December, finally the US troops reach the port of Hungnam. What they find there is about 90,000 Korean civilians who, surprisingly enough, are not terribly interested in living under communism and want to go south. So a large rescue mission is organized. Here's the Meredith Victory, which was a victory ship from the Second World War that was sent up. It was loaded with it was meant to carry about 400 people, and I think they got something like, some absurd number like 15,000 Korean civilians. I remember reading it and thinking to myself, oh my gosh, like how? But apparently, they managed to get all these people who wanted to get away from the communist regime down into the south, and God love them for doing so. And then finally, you can see them blowing up the port at Hungnam so that the North Koreans and the Chinese couldn't use it. On the 23rd of December, Walton Walker was driving on the outskirts of Seoul, and there was a convoy of heavy trucks coming the other way. One of them pulled out to pass. His Jeep hit it head on. Walker was thrown from the Jeep and killed instantly. His driver survived, I think. The next day, Matthew Ridgway was given command of the 8th Army and overall command in Korea. Here you can say Ridgway. Actually, that's Don Carlos Faith right there. Faith had been on Ridgway's staff in the 82nd Airborne. This is in Italy during the Second World War. Funny thing about Matthew Ridgway, if you come to the next lecture, you will find that I really venerate Matthew Ridgway. So I apologize if my next lecture takes on a sort of hero worshipy tone. But Matthew Ridgway did a lot of good for U.S. forces in Korea. But he liked to wear, he really viewed himself as first and foremost a paratrooper. And he liked to wear a grenade on his webbing. He often wore a first aid kit there, but people thought that he wore 2 grenades, and he was referred to colloquially as Old Iron Tits. But Ridgway was a really great manager of large forces, and I will just tell you this detail, and I'll tell you more detail. Ridgway used to go, when he got in command, he would go around to the frontline units, and he would look at the maps. They'd have these red flags where the enemy units were supposed to be, and he'd say, well, when was the last time you had contact? And they'd say, well, about 3 days ago. And he'd say, look, if you have not had contact with the enemy in the last 48 hours, take those flags off the map, because you have no idea where they are. You need to get out and find where they are, rather than just assuming. You need to get out of your trucks and get up on the ridge lines. So, and this is reported by a number of people. Ridgway didn't threaten to fire people. Ridgway would come around and say, I want you to do X, Y, and Z. And if he came back and X, Y, and Z were not done, he would just relieve you then and there. You're just like, okay, you're gone, next guy up. Because, he didn't mess around, and he didn't see the value in threatening people, right? Now, he just said, I'm going to tell people to do what needs done. And if people aren't ready to do that, I'm going to get in somebody who will. And that had a very good effect on the organization of the U.S. Army in Korea. So famously, in the course of the retreat from Hagaru-ri down to Hungnam, a reporter asked General Oliver P. Smith what his view of the withdrawal was, and Smith said, retreat hell, we're just attacking in a different direction, which was really true. Once again, Smith understood the nature of the war, which was that you had to attack where the Chinese were, and there was a large body of Chinese between the 1st Marine Division and Hungnam. So what they were doing, in a sense, was retreating because they weren't going toward the Yalu. But as far as Smith was concerned, that wasn't a realistic goal to begin with. So in fact, what they were doing was merely pursuing a more reasonable tactical and strategic goal than the one that they had been up until the end of November. So you can look at it and say, my gosh, this was a horrible defeat. And in fact, some people said that it was, the worst U.S. defeat since Bull Run, which I think is a bit of an overstatement. But it was costly. I mean, one interesting thing is, and this is another thing, I sort of probably ought to mention this earlier, but when the Chinese stopped the 5th Marine Regiment attack, they did so too early. And it was because they didn't have very good communications above regimental level. Because what they really should have done, and what they wanted to do, was to have the 5th Marine Regiment get further out from Udamni so they could be destroyed. But where they ended up stopping them, the 7th Marine Regiment and the 11th Marine Regiment artillery were able to support them, and the 5th Marines were able to move back into the perimeter and manage to survive, and to retreat in very good order, as it happened. The tale of the tape, if you will, of the battle is the U.S. suffered about 1,030 combat fatalities, 4,500, 4,600 wounded, 7,300 non-battle casualties. And that's mostly cases of frostbite. And about 4,900 missing, probably mostly captured. Conditions in the prisoner of war camps were extremely brutal, and not many of those men eventually made it back. The Chinese suffered probably on the order of 7,500 killed, 14,000 wounded, and about 30,000 non-battle casualties, and once again, that's predominantly frostbite. The result of this was, once again, U.S. retreat below Seoul. So the North Korea, I say the North Koreans, what I mean is the Chinese, eventually retook Seoul, and it was several months before the 8th Army was once again in fighting shape. So, we'll start the next talk with Operation Killer, which Matthew Ridgway staged in the early summer of 1951, and which people were like, oh my gosh, Operation Killer, that's so horrible. Matthew Ridgway was like, well, what else are we doing here? Like, well, why not call it that? Because let's be honest about what we're doing. Like, we're here to kill enemy soldiers, full stop. Also, at this point, MacArthur starts agitating, and I mean agitating publicly, to use the atomic bomb. And he says, publicly, that he has 26 targets picked out for atomic weapons. Well, he's already gotten on the wrong side of Truman by doing public political things, which really he's not allowed to do. And Truman had been very restrained, actually, about reining him in. But when this talk in public about using the atomic bomb gets going, I mean, when it became clear that things were going bad at Chosin, Truman gave this really unfortunate press conference in which they asked him what he was willing to do. Truman said, and I think I have the exact wording written down because it really is unfortunate, "We will do whatever is necessary to meet the challenge." Reporter, "Does that include the atomic bomb?" Truman, "That includes every weapon we have." It's like, no, Harry, you can't say that. It's like having a knife. You can't threaten to cut somebody, right?
You gotta do it.
Right. Either do it or don't. Either do it or don't pull it out, right? Because it only gets worse if it looks like you're waffling or whatever, or making empty threats. So, but moreover, and this is the most important thing, if you're MacArthur, you cannot be out there trying to make policy. That's not the role. And the Joint Chiefs understood this. And this would lead to problems down the line, which we'll talk about in the next talk. But the thing I want to leave you with about this is just, in reading the story of this, the incredible courage of all those guys. I mean, I don't mean to slight the U.S. Army. The Marines had a very peculiar reputation, right, up in the Korean War. The Army guys used to joke that they were nursery rhyme soldiers, the Marines were, because they were always hey diddle diddle and straight up the middle. What you see when you look at the Marine performance, the performance of the 1st Marine Division around Chosin Reservoir, is what has to be rated as the most elite combat unit on the planet in 1950. I mean, when you look at how enormously they were outnumbered and the sort of difficult conditions that they were fighting in, the conclusion that you have to draw is that the 1st Marine Division really showed that although the United States was at a little bit of a low ebb in terms of military performance, that we still had units, and the Marine Corps was that par excellence that could stack up to any military units on the planet. And that would stand us, I think, in very good stead as the conflict went forward. So that's what I have for you. Thank you so much for your attention, and